I'm Caroline Deason, and this is Rattling the Cage, the Nick Cage podcast that takes a deep dive look at one movie at a time in Nick Cage's glorious oeuvre. I'm excited to announce that Rattling the Cage is now part of the Repeater Radio family, so you should check out at @repeater_radio on Twitter and look at all their other great programming. While you're there, you can follow Rattling the Cage at Rattling Cage Pod. And Rattling the Cage is brought to you in part by the generous support of my Ko-Fi supporters. You can check out the link to the Ko-Fi over on the Twitter. And as always, thank you so much for listening and liking and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, wherever you get your podcasts. This episode's movie is The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent. If you've heard about this movie, it's probably because you heard that it's the movie where Nick Cage plays himself. When this movie was announced a few years ago, my co-host at the time, Dylan, and I marveled at how strange and serendipitous it seemed that we chose to start a podcast about Nick Cage right around the time that his career had a renaissance. And that renaissance was so pronounced that he was even doing meta movies playing himself. When it came out this year, I got loads of messages from people asking when the podcast episode on it would be out. To be honest, I wasn't thrilled about recording a podcast about this movie. I felt that, having seen only a dozen or so Nick Cage movies, and, thanks mostly in part to Dylan's penchant for picking obscure titles, I still haven't seen most of the big-name Nick Cage movies. Dylan's phrase was the Mount Rushmore Nick Cage movies. I was worried that watching and podcasting about a meta movie, I was worried I wouldn't do it justice. But I also knew that there was no way around it. The SEO is just so good. So, I bit the bullet. And guys, I'm so glad I did. This movie, regardless of how much you know about Cage and his work, is so fucking fun. I had a great time. I was smiling ear to ear through all of it. It's the kind of movie I wish I had seen in a theater, even though my bursts of laughter and squeals of glee probably would have been pretty annoying to the other patrons. You gotta see this movie. I know some of you have very kindly listened to the podcast with no intention of ever seeing the movie I'm talking about, and that's so supportive of you, and I'm so grateful for that. But seriously, do yourself a favor and go and see this one. It's wonderful. Because I want you to see this movie so badly, I'm going to keep this podcast spoiler-free. 99.9% spoiler-free. So pause it, go watch it, come back, and then we can have conversations about it on Twitter and everything else. But yeah, this is going to be pretty much spoiler-free. But I will give you a premise rundown. So, here's the premise. Nicolas Cage plays a fictionalized version of himself called Nick, spelled N-I-C-K, Cage. The spelling of the name is a tongue-in-cheek reference to how so many people shorten his name to Nick Cage, but spell it N-I-C-K when it's actually N-I-C. Anyway, Nick is hoping to land a role in a big film that will be his comeback. But don't call it a comeback, because he never really went anywhere. But he needs this role bad. These are refrains that come up again and again in the movie. His agent, played by Neil Patrick Harris, tells him that he's been offered a cool $1 million to appear at a superfan's birthday party in Spain. Nick is insulted at the idea of being a metaphorical clown at a birthday party, just there, to be a celebrity, and he turns it down, even when his agent reminds him of all of his debt and his wild spending habits. After Nick hears that he didn't land the role he was hoping for, he reluctantly agrees to the birthday party gig, and he travels to Mallorca, Spain, where he meets Javi, played by Pedro Pascal. Javi is the superfan, and his charm and sincerity bring Nick out of his shell, and the two become fast friends. However, it turns out, Javi is also the leader of a crime syndicate responsible for kidnapping the daughter of a Catalan politician. At least according to the CIA agents who have decided to emotionally blackmail Nick into acting as their eyes on the inside of Javi's mansion. So suddenly, a character study movie starts turning into an action movie, And as it does, the two protagonists, who are, by the way, writing a screenplay together, start to evolve their film ideas from character-driven, nuanced performance to big drug scenes and big explosions. Oh, and also every so often, Nick Cage's younger self appears to Nick like a strange ghost or weird alter ego that only he can see, and screams at him, just like the YouTube clips and memes do, to just be a movie star. Not an actor, a motherfucking movie star. Okay. If you're still somehow unsure if this is a movie you want to see, let me explain. Whether you're a Nick Cage fan or not, this is a movie for people who love movies. This is the kind of movie that makes you want to make movies. It's so much fun, and it's so meta, and the way it looks at the creative process / commercial process of movie making, and the way it looks at the difference between blockbuster movie stardom and artistic actors, I mean, it's worth the price of admission just for that.
Okay, you just run out there, you get the truck, you come back and get me, I will keep a lookout.
Love it. Love the plan. But maybe you should go, and I'll stay here.
I love that plan, I do. But you are a faster runner than me. I saw how fast you were in National Treasure.
No, that'd be the stunt department.
Not according to the making of featurette.
Fine, I'll go.
But this movie is also fun and charming, and the performances are excellent. But going back to what I said about movie stardom and artistic actors, isn't that the very crux of the enigma I've been trying to articulate since the very first episode of this podcast? Who is Nick Cage? What is Nick Cage? Is he a movie star? Is he a leading man? An action hero? Is he a talented actor capable of moving performances with nuance? Or is he just a guy who screams a lot and is meme-worthy? We've talked about on the podcast whether Nick Cage is in on the joke. He was interviewed at some point and he said, yes, he is in on it. Well, if there was ever any doubt about that, the unbearable weight of massive talent shows that he's not only in on the joke, but it kind of seems like the joke has been on us the whole time, the audience. Even if Cage has seemed to do movies just for the money, like we guessed when we saw and podcasted on Left Behind, I think now that the ball has always been in his possession, as it were. The enigma of Nick Cage continues because he described the fictional version of him, Nick with a K, in The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, as bearing little resemblance to him in real life. But wouldn't that just be something he would say to steer the narrative? I now believe he's been steering the narrative since day one. This is a guy who changed his last name from Coppola to Cage to step out of the shadow of his famous family. And by the way, as an aside, the weird young version of him, the imaginary version of him in the movie, is credited as a separate person with the name Nicholas Kim Coppola, which is Nick Cage's birth name. Also the name under which he was credited in that awful movie that Dylan forced me to podcast on, The Best of Times. Which wasn't even a movie, it was a TV pilot. Why did I let Dylan talk me into doing that? Man. Ugh. It's fine. So few people have seen that. And really, doesn't that mean that I'm even more well-suited to talk about a movie like The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent because I've seen, his very humble beginnings when he was still credited as a Coppola, when his teeth were not fixed yet, when he didn't have his veneers. Anyway, I digress. Back to my confusion about where he fits into Hollywood's landscape. I now think that mystery is partly designed by the man himself. I think that's partly by design. I mean, you definitely can't box this guy into anything. A few months ago, in March 2022, just around the time that this movie was coming out, GQ did a cover story called Nicolas Cage Can Explain It All. The author of that piece is Gabriella Paella. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. She interviewed Cage, and it's an incredible interview, by the way. This is another thing that, a bunch of my friends sent to me asking if I'd seen these just outrageous photos from it, and if I'd read the interview. And this is another thing that I was like, should I wait to read this? Should I, how much of this is kind of going to influence what I think of Nick Cage going forward? And, how much of this experiment of this podcast is me kind of coming at it with the fresh eyes? Well, I'm really glad that I read it. I highly recommend Nicolas Cage Can Explain It All from March 2022, as I said. And I'm going to talk about it a bit in this episode, because since it came out around the same time as the movie, it's, you know, inextricably linked. It's almost like necessary reading after seeing the movie. So Gabriela Paella wrote that Nick Cage actually feared that he would be making a joke of himself if he played himself, and that he also didn't love that the character is a narcissistic and aloof father. She also explains that even though Cage wasn't fond of becoming a meme and YouTube supercut fodder back in, you know, the early aughts, or the 2010s, I guess it was, it did help him become more beloved than ever, and in a lot of ways paved the way for the Nick Cage renaissance that I'm calling it. She writes that fans get tattoos of his face, attend day-long Cage movie marathons, and then, quote, go home to rest their weary heads on multiple versions of Nick Cage novelty sequin pillows, end quote. In one scene in The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, Javi shows Nick a secret room full of movie memorabilia. It's like a shrine to the actor Nick Cage. There's the chainsaw from Mandy, the bunny from Con Air. There's a life-size wax sculpture of Nick Cage. There's also a sequined pillow of Nick Cage's face. You know, the kind where if you rub the sequins one way, they're plain red, and then if you rub them the other way, it reveals a photo of his face. Yeah, the kind on this pillow I have in my own home right here that a dear friend got me for Christmas. Because when you host a Nick Cage podcast, those are the types of things that you get as gifts from people. Javi has that pillow, the exact same one, in his Nick Cage shrine, well, memorabilia room. And Nick, the character, approaches the pillow and declares, "That's just really creepy." Javi insists, no, it's not creepy. Javi is hurt that Nick would find this creepy. His own face on a pillow with sequins that you move back and forth. Anyway, I insist that yes, it is creepy. But that's part of what makes it great. There's a metaphor there. This movie is deeply uncanny, really, when you look at it. Nicolas Cage, as Nick Cage, sees himself in this shrine, this memorabilia room that Javi has made. He's literally reaching out and touching his own face on a weird pillow, looking into the eyes of the wax figure. There's this gorgeous shot where the camera slowly moves to line up the reflection of Nick looking into the glass that houses the wax figure of him, where the reflection of the glass, so his actual reflection, matches up with what is a pseudo-reflection of the wax figure standing there. It's a psychoanalytic film. It's Freudian. It's got these layers that if you start to peel them back, you wonder, okay, well, how much of this is artifice? How much of this is actually, what is artifice when we're talking about film? When we're talking about acting? How much is meta? How much is metaphor? I think these were the types of questions that Cage was asking while he was filming this. I think this is what the writers were getting at. And I think they succeeded in this study, this character study, this genre study, and this close-up look at this mythic, eccentric person / actor / character, and every sense of all of those words.
You can't quit acting, you can't!
That's none of your business.
Whether you like it or not, you have a gift. And that gift brings light and joy to an increasingly dark and broken world. And to turn your back on that gift is to turn your back on the entire human race. We have to go now! We have to jump!
You're in an untenable situation. You know that, right? Then let's get you out of here alive.
Speaking of metaphor, speaking of meta, in the GQ article, Cage says that part of doing the movie, which he declined to do 3 or 4 times before relenting, again, meta, was a way of embracing the memified version of himself. Also in that GQ article, there's a lovely video of Cage responding to internet questions and posts about himself, where he says that the abs in Ghost Rider really were his, but that everyone thinks they're CGI. So he will never work that hard again in his life, because what's the point? If everyone already thinks they're CGI, might as well just use CGI for them. So first, I'd like to apologize for saying that they must be fake back in our Ghost Rider episode. And second, I'd like to say that there's something really refreshing hearing an artist say, well, if people are going to assume it's fake, I might as well fake it. Sometimes we gotta pick our battles, I guess. Also in the article, I'm very excited to report that Nick Cage says that Vampire's Kiss is his fave of the movies that he's made. As you may remember, Vampire's Kiss has been my favorite of all the movies that I've podcasted on so far. And if we want to come to the rating portion of the podcast, I still think Vampire's Kiss is my favorite, but without any shadow of a doubt, the Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent has taken the second place spot. One last thing about the GQ article. I won't spoil one of the most outrageous parts of the movie, but the GQ article does. So watch the movie first, then head over to the article to learn why it's even more wonderful than I thought it was. A hint is that it occurs between Nick and his alter ego, imaginary projection of himself, who, by the way, is called Nicky. He refers to him as Nicky. And it's a very special encounter between the two of them. I've seen a couple of movies this year that fall into one of the categories Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent occupies. If, you could categorize it into different categories. It's beyond categorization in a lot of ways. But those movies that I'm comparing it to are Nobody, starring Bob Odenkirk, and 3 Days to Kill, starring Kevin Costner. I have, by the way, recently become completely enamored with Kevin Costner, to the point where friends are asking me if I'm starting a Kevin Costner podcast. What do you think? Should I? I'll let you get back to me about that. Anyway, both of these movies are about men in their 50s who have retired or are near retirement from a life of action-packed, ambiguous government agency work where they were killing machines. The stress and secrecy of their professional lives has made it so that their home life is strained at best, and they each want to win over their estranged families. They also each have to take up the role of action hero one last time, or so it would seem, and each movie is, in my opinion, a lot of fun. In The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, Nick is an actor who is now over the hill, whose action movie days are behind him, and whose family has been alienated over years of his being too wrapped up in his work. He needs to score a big role so that he can come back, but don't call it a comeback, and prove to everyone, his family included, that he's worthy. He finds himself accidentally becoming the action hero he used to play, and he finds out that it's not as easy as playing a scripted role. Cage has some great comedic bits where he really takes the piss out of himself, where you're watching an actor playing an actor who has done this type of thing in movies before, but in real life, it's a whole different ballgame. So we have this great removal, looking at an actor playing an actor failing at performing an action hero in real life. But Nick is ultimately able to dig deep into his talent and his skill when it matters most and save the day. One thing I especially loved in the movie was all the references to the phrase Cage coined to describe his acting, nouveau shamanic. Do you remember that? We've talked about it on the podcast before, and he explains in the GQ video I mentioned that this is a reference to a book by Brian Bates called The Way of the Actor. Bates describes acting as an extension of shamanic storytelling ritual from hundreds and thousands of years ago. Cage says that he added the nouveau because he liked the way the French sounded. In the movie, he mentions his nouveau shamanic style a few times, which again blurs some of the lines between how much of this is Nick Cage playing a fictionalized version of himself, how much of this is Nick Cage playing a character who is Nick, who is just an actor who has similarities to Nick Cage, ad infinitum. Another thing I loved about this movie was Pedro Pascal. What a blessing that man is. My goodness. The relationship between his character, Javi, and Nick, it's total homosocial romantic friendship. I've talked about homosociality and Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick before on the other podcast that Dylan and I used to do called Netflix. And, you know, I don't want to refer to this relationship as a bromance between these two characters because, one, the word bromance is so overdone and also fraught with references to Judd Apatow that I don't want to reference. But two, this goes beyond bromance. I think this is actually, you know, what I want to describe as a homosocial romantic friendship. Pascal, as the fawning but entirely sincere superfan, is effervescent. He is just a joy to behold on screen. And it's really a credit to Cage as a performer that he's able to make the chemistry between their two characters seem so genuine. Because I read in a review that said that Pascal was a scene stealer. And even though he's lightning in this movie, I think it's worth pointing out that the way Cage and Pascal work together, playing off each other and giving each other room to breathe and to act, is the real scene stealer. It's their chemistry that works so well.
What's the worry here, Nick? You've lost some of your talent as an actor?
No.
And finally, that brings me to wanting to comment on Cage's acting. I'm sure I've gone on record on this podcast as wondering if Cage is always nailing it in his performances, and I seem to remember that over the years I've come to believe that yes, he is a skilled and talented performer. Because those are different things after all, skill and talent. One can have talent but not hone it, and, you know, not develop the skill used that is necessary to really use that talent to the best of its ability. That's obvious. We all understand that. But if I had any doubt in my mind about Nick Cage's abilities, and if you have any doubt in your mind, I challenge you to watch this movie, and to enjoy this movie. Because in this movie, I see a performer performing effortlessly. Okay, now you're thinking, well, that's because he's playing himself. Of course it's effortless. No. In this movie, we get to see 3 or 4 meta performances of Nicolas Cage, or Nick with a K Cage. The layering of truth or fiction, fiction as truth, truth becoming fiction, which part is fiction, which part is truth, etc., is part of what makes this movie so much fun, but it's also what coalesced so many other performances I've seen Nick Cage give. I'm so glad I didn't avoid this movie, because I hadn't seen enough of the ones that came before it. Now I get to watch those movies through this new lens that I have after watching Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent.
It's the easiest gig ever. You play yourself.
There's actually a ton of references to other Nick Cage movies in the film, including my beloved Moonstruck, and including the next film I'll be talking about in the next episode of Rattling the Cage. In a scene in The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, the superfan Javi gives a speech at his birthday party where he tells a touching story about how he and his dying father were able to reconnect just before his death. The only thing that could bring them back together was quoting the 1994 movie starring Shirley MacLaine as a former First Lady and Nicolas Cage as her assigned Secret Service officer, the movie titled Guarding Tess. That's the next movie in the next episode of Rattling the Cage. I'm Caroline Deason. Thank you so much for listening.